Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a 60-year Cold War between the Italian state and the papacy. We're going to look at exactly how this incredibly stubborn standoff forged the world's absolute smallest sovereign state. It's a fascinating story. We're talking lost empires, diplomatic breakthroughs, and political drama that literally still shapes the map of Europe today. Let's get right into it.
Think about looking at a map of Rome. Having a completely independent nation sitting right smack in the middle of a bustling capital city. It's an incredible geographical and political anomaly. So it begs the question, how on earth did a 108-acre walled enclave actually become its own country? Well, to understand the solution, we first have to define the problem. Historians formally call this the Roman question. See, for over 1,000 years, the popes weren't just spiritual leaders, they were actual kings. They ruled over a huge swath of central Italy known as the Papal States. But right around the mid-19th century, the fractured states of the Italian peninsula started unifying into a single kingdom of Italy. And the Pope's territory? It was caught right in the crosshairs.
This unification basically stripped the Pope of his centuries-old temporal power overnight. Back in the 1860s, the new Kingdom of Italy occupied the eastern parts of the Papal States. Then came 1870, the definitive blow. The capture of Rome itself. The Italian army literally breached the city walls. Suddenly, the Pope was left with just a tiny fraction of land on Vatican Hill. The very next year, the Italian parliament tried to address this totally unprecedented situation by passing something they called the Law of Guarantees.
Which brings us to our first major chapter, the era of the prisoner in the Vatican.
So to really understand this standoff, we need to look at what that 1871 Law of Guarantees actually proposed. The Italian government was trying for a domestic fix, a compromise. They offered the Pope the use of the Vatican and later in palaces and threw in certain sovereign perks like the right to send and receive ambassadors. They made the palaces tax-exempt and even offered a regular annual income to cover the Holy See's massive administrative costs. Now, on paper, to the Italian lawmakers, this probably seemed like a pretty fair, pragmatic solution, right? A free church and a free state.
And let's talk about that income. Italy offered a staggering 3.25 million lira annually. At the time, that was a massive sum of money. But Pope Pius IX, he flatly rejected it on principle. He never touched a single coin of that endowment. His argument was that if he accepted the money, he'd essentially be submitting to the Kingdom of Italy. He'd be acknowledging them as his legitimate landlord, and there was just no way he was going to do that.
The real sticking point here was the legal nature of the law itself. Since it was enacted unilaterally by the Italian parliament, that same parliament could theoretically just vote to revoke those rights whenever they felt like it. It wasn't a treaty between equals. So in protest, the popes locked themselves away for 59 years. 59 years! They refused to ever set foot outside the Vatican walls, embracing this kind of ironic title of prisoner in the Vatican, even though they were living inside a luxurious palace. They wouldn't even step out onto the main balcony facing St. Peter's Square, just to make sure they didn't give any appearance of recognizing Italian authority over Rome.
But the protest went way beyond just staying indoors. The papacy issued a famous decree, non expedit, which basically translates to, it is not expedient. This strictly forbade Italian Catholics from voting in parliamentary elections or holding any office under the Crown of Italy. Think about that. For decades, the Holy See was actively telling the Catholic masses of Italy to politically boycott their own new state. This created absolute massive internal tension. Everyday citizens were completely torn between loyalty to their new nation and obedience to the Church.
All right, moving on to the breakthrough, the Lateran Pacts of 1929. So, after nearly 6 decades of this silent, stubborn hostility, the political landscape shifts, forcing both sides back to the negotiating table. The crucial difference between that failed 1871 law and the successful 1929 treaty really comes down to the legal mechanism. The 1871 law was just a domestic piece of Italian legislation. Italy was basically treating the church like a subject. But the 1929 Lateran Treaty, that was a bilateral agreement, a real international treaty signed between two recognizing sovereign entities. By finally negotiating on equal footing, the Italian government gave the Pope the exact thing he needed above all else: absolute, internationally recognized independence.
To actually pull this off, the Lateran Pacts were cleanly structured into 3 distinct parts. First up, a political treaty. This literally mapped out and created the independent state of Vatican City. Next, a financial convention to finally compensate the Church for losing the Papal States. And third, a concordat, which is essentially an agreement regulating the Catholic Church's status within Italy moving forward. Packaged together, these 3 documents establish the absolute independence of the Vatican City state that we all know today.
Now, it's a really fascinating piece of history that this monumental treaty was actually negotiated and signed on behalf of the Italian king by the fascist government led by Benito Mussolini. From Mussolini's perspective, settling this Roman question was a massive PR win. It brought him immense domestic prestige and helped legitimize his government with Italy's overwhelming Catholic majority. On the flip side, for Pope Pius XI, who was represented by Cardinal Gaspari, it was just a necessary diplomatic reality. It secured the physical and legal borders of the Holy See, regardless of who happened to be holding the pen for Italy at the time.
Remember that massive annual payout from 1871 that the Pope rejected? Well, the Holy See did eventually accept a definitive financial settlement in 1929. But this time around, the deal was 750 million lira in immediate cash, plus a billion lira in consolidated state bonds, all to compensate for the lost territories. This was a huge influx of capital, and it was accepted as a full, final settlement of all financial claims against Italy. More importantly, it gave the newly independent Vatican City the foundational economic security it absolutely needed to operate its own global administration completely free from relying on the Italian state.
That brings us to our final section, modern revisions and legacy. You see, the 1929 treaty didn't just freeze history in place. It evolved right alongside the Italian state. In 1948, after World War II, the new democratic Italian Republic actually enshrined the Lateran treaties directly into its own constitution. But, of course, society was changing fast. The biggest shift happened in 1984, when both sides sat down and agreed to a major revision of the Concordat. The most crucial change? They mutually declared that Catholicism would no longer be considered the sole state religion of Italy. It was a move that reflected a more secular, modern democracy, while still totally respecting the Vatican's independent sovereignty.
With the end of that exclusive state financial support, Italy introduced something called the 8 per mille, which means 8 per thousand. It's a tax system where, today, Italian taxpayers mandatorily direct 0.8% of their income tax to either a recognized religion or a state-run charity. It's an incredibly structured way for the state to let citizens fund religious institutions, completely replacing those old direct endowments. And let me tell you, it remains a massive source of funding for the Catholic Church in Italy today.
And the relationship between these two states is still evolving right now. In 2008, the Vatican actually announced it would no longer automatically adopt Italian civil laws as its own, specifically pointing to laws that conflict with Catholic doctrine. It's a pretty stark reminder that while the Lateran treaties solve the geographical standoff, the ideological boundaries, those require constant, delicate navigation. So as the world keeps changing around it, we have to wonder, how will the world's absolute smallest sovereign state continue to navigate the laws of the future?